All right, so this is the second part of the economics lecture on less developed countries. Sorry, I had my kids coming in the room last time. I had to cut it off short. What we were talking about was what are some of the problems that LDCs have in trying to do what we call primary production, which is producing the actual raw materials, resource extraction, and agricultural production. Um, One of the things that, in order to go from being a less developed country to a more developed country, is to have the resources and the capital goods that allow for secondary production, which is to take the primary good and to turn it into something. You can harvest wheat and have wheat and sell wheat, or you can have a factory that turns it into flour. The flour is easier to ship, it's lighter to ship, you're going to make more money off of it because you've added some value to it by making it into flour. If you can then turn that into something else, then you can even go to the next level. The problem with that is these countries don't make the secondary capital goods. And so they have to buy them. And where do they buy them? Buy them from other countries. And what do you have to buy stuff from other countries? Foreign exchange. Forex. The problem is exchange rates often aren't very reasonable between these less developed countries and the more developed countries. They fluctuate wildly. When should you make a investment decision? Well, when you have a good exchange rate. But do you know when you're going to have a good exchange rate? Can you wait for a good exchange rate? Things like that in order to make business decisions, and that makes it harder to have a stable economy in these less developed nations. Okay, the next thing to talk about with less developed countries is that oftentimes their behavior leads to environmental problems. We talked a lot about green GDP earlier. That idea that we need to worry about our economy and our stability and our ability to continue going on for years and decades even. In a less developed country, one of the things you want to do is you want to have more agriculture. Well, let's talk about Brazil. Brazil's a great example of this. You probably talked about this in your other classes. Brazil has a problem, and that is that they want to farm. They're really good at farming. They're great at it. The problem is their country is covered by the Amazon rainforest, and so they've been burning down the Amazon rainforest in order to make room for corn. Now, what do they do with that corn? They take the corn, they put it into factories, and they pop out ethanol. They are an ethanol exporting country. They have more than enough ethanol for themselves. They don't have any oil, so it actually makes them more stable. These are all good things for their economy, maybe bad for the rest of us on the planet who won't have enough oxygen to breathe when the Amazon rainforest is gone. So deforestation, land degradation that comes from that, the erosion that comes from taking out the forests, mountain topping, one of the things they talk about, when you're looking for coal or other precious minerals in the ground, they just go and take out entire mountainsides. Those mountainsides then start to erode and fall apart and clog rivers and mess with fisheries and all sorts of things like that. The water pollution that comes from that is as these the tailings from these minerals that are pulled out of the ground and then washed down into rivers, pollute the rivers, kill the fish, have less water to drink in some of these places where they don't have enough. To begin with. So each of these can happen separately. They can also happen together. Overfishing is one of the things. A lot of these countries LDCs are near the oceans. A lot of them are tropical or subtropical, and so they fish for a living. They can make good money fishing. Anybody can make good money fishing. You go throw out a net and fill it up. The problem is once you overfish and there are no more fish, the fish can't reproduce, and then all of a sudden the production that you had is gone. Air pollution, the big one. So as you start having factories, you start having to burn things for energy. In America, we burn coal for energy, but we have really clean coal power plants compared to other countries. We also have a massive country, and it's pretty spread out. We use a lot of other things for electricity. In the western United States, we use a lot of hydroelectric, which is perfectly clean. Might not be perfectly environmentally healthy, but perfectly clean. China has coal. They have lots and lots of coal, like central Utah, but way more. And their coal is dirty, dirty coal. Those of you that have been there, those of you that know what it's like, very, very dirty. but it powers their country, and they're able to get power and industry out of that very, very cheaply, and allows them to develop. We have the same problem in the United States in the 19th century. You've probably all seen the stories about like Pittsburgh. I was going to call it Steelers. The steel mills and the acid rain that came from that, the massive air pollution. I remember my favorite story of this is in Utah, down in Utah County. I lived in Lehigh when I was a kid, and they reopened Geneva Steel, which had been closed down in the 80s because steel had gotten cheaper other places. Well, they decided they'd open it up again, try and make money out of this huge factories down there. I lived in Lehigh right by the point of the mountain. And when they opened that steel mill back up, for about a week, our cars were covered with an inch at the end of the day of soot, of like rust-colored soot. It basically covered the entire Utah Valley in an inch or two of soot each day for weeks, from one factory. Imagine what that's like when you have more and more and more factories, smaller spaces, over longer and longer periods of time. They had actually cleaned up the factory. They were just clearing out the old stuff. They weren't even making new stuff when that happened. So that's a good example of air pollution. And then the climate change that can cover this. The climate change that can cause problems in these countries. A lot of these countries, once again, are by the water, which means that one tsunami, one big storm, a hurricane, a tornado, a typhoon, whatever it might be, can come in and wipe out massive parts of these countries' economies. All right. That's it for now. We'll come back and we'll talk about more later. LDC's part 2. All right. We're back for the last part of just the basics of what economically is going on in LDC. This part 3 is economic inequality. What are the two ways that we measure economic inequality? Think about it. We use the Gini coefficient and the Lorenz curve as the two ways in which we measure economic inequality in a country. One of the things that you look for in a country that is stable and doing well is economic inequality. Now, you might say, wait, that doesn't make any sense. You do. You need economic inequality in order to have economic growth. Too much economic inequality will retard growth, because if you have too many rich people, too few rich people, too many poor people, you'll end up with social unrest, and oftentimes even civil wars or a socialist takeover, communist takeover, whatever it might be. A dictator comes in, throws everything apart. But on the other side of that, the other side of the coin, is that in a country that doesn't have any economic equality, either everybody's poor or everybody's pretty even, or a communist takeover, there's no more reason to try to grow, because what are you going to get out of it? What are you going to get for your extra work? There's no economic incentive for the work, and so the countries don't grow. So you need just the right amount. They actually have measured it, and they say the right amount in terms of the Gini coefficient is somewhere between 25 and 40. Anything lower than 25 is going to be a problem. Anything higher than 40 becomes a problem. America is just up there right at that kind of 40 level, and then you have places like Sweden and Finland that are down there at the 25 level. Most of the developed countries are somewhere right in between there. In order to have economic growth, one of the things that you're going to see is an increase in GDP. Well, hopefully that would also lead to an increase in GDP per capita, which would then lead to everybody being better off in society. Now, might not be better off at equal levels, but better off overall. The countries that you see that have too much inequality, you see all of the countries of the Middle East, all the oil-producing countries in the Middle East, have massive, because you have the richest people in the world. And then you have everybody else in those countries. And basically everybody else doesn't need to do anything, because the countries are so rich that they kind of take care of their people to keep them from rebelling. Those are great examples of, they have tons and tons of money coming in. They could do so much development. But really outside of Dubai, you don't have a lot of real growth or infrastructure or attempt to make an economy that can last outside of the income derived from the oil. All right, that's that for now. We'll come back and we'll talk about what are the demographic characteristics, really quick, of LDCs. All right, now we're talking about the similarities and differences of different LDCs and what makes them alike and what makes them dissimilar. Specifically, looking at a lot of the demographics. So the first thing you're seeing in almost every LDC is you're going to have really high birth rates. It's fine to have lots of children. The problem is being able to invest in those children. If you live in Utah, you make $100,000 a year, you can have 10 children, you could be fine. Because you have the time and the money to be able to invest in those children, help them grow. But in a country where you don't have any money and you have children because the children are an economic aid to you, you put them to work, you sell them in some countries, whatever it is you do with the children in order for them to be a positive on your family economics. You have lots of children. That keeps both parents out of the workforce. Usually you have one parent in the workforce. And because the other one is in the workforce, your labor force can't grow. The other term here is dependency rates. Dependency rates are the people who are not productive in society. They're not members of the labor force. Now, in America, we have the problem of you can be 35 and still live in your mom's basement and not be really a part of the labor force. It's not a full-time part of the labor force. But overall, that's not a huge problem. In less developed countries, though, when you have people who only have a life expectancy of, let's say, 55, and the average woman has usually 5 to 8 children, depending on which country it is that you're looking at. Some of them even higher than 8, or at least pregnancies. Then that woman is going to be taking care of children for 15 or 20 years. If she starts having children, let's do a conservative 18 years old, and she is taking care of children through their age of 18, which is 36 years old. Plus she has 8 children. You do that once every year and a half. That's also going to leave you another 12 years of spread. And so they're looking at 50 by the time their children are out of the home. But if you have a life expectancy of 55 or 60 years, you have no time at all in your lifetime to be a productive member of society. That keeps the labor force down. When you don't have time to build up savings, which is the next part of this, it's called the poverty cycle. The poverty cycle is when you live at a subsistence level and you don't have extra money, then you don't save. And when you don't save, then you can't invest in human capital or physical capital. You can't start businesses. You can't become an entrepreneur because you don't have anything saved up in order to be able to do that. You can't take time off because you'll starve to death. Your family will starve to death in order to go back and get an education, to do anything like that. So the poverty cycle starts with you don't have enough income. Because you don't have enough income, you don't save. Because you don't save, then you don't invest. And then when you don't invest, you don't become more productive, and so you can't make more money, and so you stay at that level. That poverty cycle, when you have more and more and more children born into that, you as a parent are not able to invest in your kids. Your kids then get back into the poverty cycle as they get low wage jobs. That's all you have in your country. When you end up with a country where, like Liberia, where 90% of your population, 95% of the population live in moderate or severe extreme poverty, there's no way your country can ever grow because there's nobody that can add value to the system. And there aren't enough people that could even get the jobs if you did have the jobs. Even if America came into Liberia, which we formed, if you remember your American history, and said, we're going to give you billions of dollars, we're going to build you everything, we're going to give you an amazing economy. They couldn't do it. There's no way that they could keep that up because they don't have anybody that could work in that economy with the necessary skills, education, and ability to keep the capital going. All right, some of the other things that these LDCs have is a large informal sector, they call it, basically the black market. People who work outside of the measurable economy. People who do trade, people who don't pay taxes, people who do things that are illegal. oftentimes can actually be more lucrative, as we find out in the United States in our inner cities where you have the same thing, the poverty cycle, which leads to an informal or black market economy. Those things don't ever lead to investment. You don't invest in the black market because you don't have the protections of the government in order to protect your investment. All right, now let's talk about the differences of LDCs. So each LDC is slightly different. You have Sub-Saharan Africa, but even in Sub-Saharan Africa, you have Eastern Africa, which is much more desert, in Ethiopia, Somalia. And then you have Western Sub-Saharan Africa, like Nigeria, which is a tropical rainforest. They have very different resource endowments. The things that they get, they are able to pull out of the ground, that they're able to sell to other people. In Central America and South America, you have rainforests. You have different minerals that you're pulling out of the ground. You have gold in some of these countries. You don't have any gold in some of the countries. You have some of the rare earth elements in some of the countries. You don't have any in other countries. You have coal in some countries. You don't have some in other countries. Oil. Some of these countries have oil. Some don't. Nigeria's got huge reserves of oil. But their ability to get at it versus a country that even if they can get at it, doesn't make them necessarily more productive or increase their national GDP or economy. All right, climate is another thing you have to look at, and we kind of mentioned that before. If you have, if you live in a place where there are lots of tropical hurricanes or whatever they're called in the southern hemisphere, typhoons, that's it. You can lose all your investment very, very quickly. A temperate climate that allows you to work year round. A temperate climate that allows you to have water for production all the time is needed. And so a lot of these countries don't have that basic idea. But the climates can be very, very different, from temperate to arid to rainforest to a place like Argentina that runs the gamut of everything that we have in the United States, from really nice Buenos Aires, where it's, like San Diego, all the way down to the frozen tundra of the south next to Antarctica. Many of them have different histories, and those histories lead to different backgrounds of people, different languages. For example, Hong Kong, which was a less developed country and a very developed country now, it had the British, and the British stayed, and the British kept building it up, and they had investment from other countries, whereas some of the other islands near Hong Kong are not nearly as developed. Some of the countries near that aren't as developed because they don't have that. India is another one where India has English as a language that allows them to trade with the world and to do business that countries that don't speak English and can't do. How long they've been an independent country. Which country? One of the interesting research that I've looked at is which country was the colonial owner, motherland, of the country back during colonies. Makes a huge difference. What that country did, what that country gave to the people of that colony when they left, and the situation they left them in. Those of you in HL history, which is basically everybody, right? You've seen this. You've talked about it. Probably the what was going on during World War I and World War II and especially as we get in the mandate system, and what happened to these countries, really set them on a trajectory to either be more successful or less successful than other countries. Their political systems make a difference. You've got a huge difference between countries that are controlled by a totalitarian dictator versus ones that have fairly stable economies, democratic economies. You have ones that have had war, whether it was the Chinese Civil War or the Vietnamese Civil War, the Vietnam War. Or you have countries that are still in the middle of warlords fighting over their countries in Somalia, South Sudan, things like that. And then from that you get economic stability. The longer you can be stable, the better your economy is going to be. The harder it is for your country to stay stable, the harder your country is going to be to grow. All right, that's that. We'll come back next time and talk about different indicators. And you guys have already done the assignment on this, so we're just going to glance over it quick. Hopefully you got the stuff on the single indicators, multiple indicators. Talk about that later. Okay, I only want to spend a couple minutes on this because you guys have already done the assignment. Hopefully you've got it. Just kind of bring it all together, what we would do at the end if I was there. Um, Indicators of where you are as an LDC. First, we have the single indicators, the specific points. This is what Gapminder is great for. When you go into Gapminder, you can pull out each of these individual points. You can pull out the multiple indicators. You can pull out the composite indicators, and you can watch them and compare them to other countries. You can compare them over time, which is always fun. To see how countries develop, which countries developed, which countries changed these indicators, increase the ones that are good, decrease the ones that were bad. And going from there. All right. So first one is per capita GDP. The individual, how much money does your country make, is an indicator of how much economic growth you have. It's all GDP is good for. Remember, GDP is just it's not good as a this number really means something. It's what is this number over last year's number or the year before? Are we growing? Are we shrinking? Yeah, does it explain everything? No. Does it show that you have growth? Yes. Very important. If you want to change from being an LDC to being a developed country, you need growth. But one of the things they're going to look at is instead of just looking at GDP, they're going to look at per capita GDP because huge countries with huge economies mean less than a small country with a moderate economy. So per capita GDP or per capita GNI, gross national income. Remember that one? Measures a little bit better for what's staying in the country because with GDP, you're not measuring the things that are leaving that country, the things that are foreign owned, things like that. So GNI is a much better measure for that. All right, the next one is purchasing power parity. What can a person in this country buy versus what a person in another country buy? With the money, it takes into effect exchange rates, what you can get in your own country versus what has to be imported from other countries. And that purchasing power parity really is helpful for comparing these countries and what you can actually get in a country. For example, some of the Central American countries, it's actually really cheap to live. You can basically get everything. They trade in U.S. dollars. You can buy things in U.S. dollars, and it's actually, in terms of purchasing power parity, they actually are doing really well. They're not considered to be hurting, even though they might have a huge GDP. Because of just the way that their economy works and the things that are going on there, they actually are able to have a lot of growth. All right, so the next one, sorry about that, I got a phone call from the school, funny enough. Health indicators. So, as has been mentioned, the healthier you are, the longer you live, the healthier you are when you're living, allow you to be more productive, and thusly, as each individual is more productive, then your GDP per capita is automatically going to go up. So some of the things they look at is fertility rate, how many babies you have. Countries that are more developed have lower fertility rates. Now, fertility rates, as you saw in demographic winner, can't get too low or you don't have replacement level fertility, and then your population starts to shrink, and then either you have to import people in order to keep your economy going, or import probably isn't quite the right word, allow more immigration, or your economy is going to start shrinking, or each individual has to become much more productive in order to keep your GDP at the level that it's at. But at the same time, if you have too high a fertility rate, then you're going to have problems because people are pregnant too often. Women are pregnant too often, they can't be productive members of society. Also, you can't take care of that many children. You're not able to save because you have so many children that you're paying for and things like that. The next one is female life expectancy. How long can they be a productive member of society outside of the childbearing years? You look at a country like Japan that has a life expectancy of 83 years for a woman, whereas in the Congo it's 48 years. So basically, you live twice as long if you're in Japan, and so you can be productive for twice as long. Plus, the fertility rate of Japan is 3.8 births per 100 women, or 1,000 women. Per year. That's hardly anything. It is a little below replacement level. They have a problem there. But it's basically 200 in Congo. So in Congo, you have, trying to do the math, I think it's 50 times. Yeah, that'd be right. 50 times the fertility, 50 as women in Japan, but they live half as long and thus they can't be as productive in the long run. The next one, education indicators. we do three things when we look at education. One is literacy rates, how many people can read in your country. Um, the ability to read allows you to learn. The learning is the way that you invest in human capital. And so without the ability to learn, you're not going to be able to invest in human capital to the extent and have growth. Um, Many countries in Europe have a 100% literacy rate or a 99% literacy rate. America has actually the lowest literacy rate of any developed country. Whereas you look at some of the African nations and you have 55% literacy rates. And these are pretty low level literacy rates. Like, this isn't, I'm perfectly college literate. This is, I'm perfectly elementary school literate. The next one is teacher pupil ratio. So a normal teacher pupil ratio in a developed country, outside of America once again, and especially outside of Utah, thank you, my class of 30 or whatever we have in there, 35, is in Europe you're looking at under 10. The average teacher pupil ratio is under 10. In Utah, we have a teacher pupil ratio of like 29, I think is the technical number that we have. And in most of your classes, you're going to be well into the 30s range. And basically in all of Utah, you're into the 30s. But in Africa, you're going to have a teacher pupil ratio of 100. It's already hard enough as it is, and that's with good teachers, with good technology, in a good school, with every advantage. We pack you deep and teach cheap, but that's nothing compared to being in a dirt-floored schoolhouse with 100 kids in a form, one teacher trying to keep those kids going. You're just not going to get the education that you need, and without that education, you're not going to be able to grow. All right, so those are single indicators. Let's talk multiple indicators. Multiple indicators are things that we just put together. So one is the World Bank. The World Bank does a ton of stuff in order to research where the economic development of countries are. They look at all sorts of things, and when they measure what level a country is at and economic level a country is at, they look at the ratio of boys to girls in school. Are girls getting education? That's one of the things that you don't have economic growth when only boys are being educated. You have that in a lot of the Central Asian countries, a lot of the African countries. They look at how clean their country is. If there's a lot of pollution, then you're going to have more health problems, and you're destroying your economy. And you might have economic growth, but you're not having economic development, so the country's not becoming more developed. They take all of these things together and measure where the countries are at. The United Nations Millennium Developmental Goals is another one. All the goals, let's get every country below certain levels on all of these things. Combating AIDS, better reduce child mortality, increased education, vaccination rates, things like that, goals to achieve. There's a whole bunch of these. So the multiple indicators are just a whole bunch of indicators by some group that they go out and measure, and then they can say, are we doing better, or are we doing worse? And targeting very specific things that can help a country to develop more appropriately. The composite indicators, the big one is the Human Development Index, put together by the UN Developmental Program. It measures how developed your country is. It just does a ranking of all the countries from least developed to most developed. From Zimbabwe and Congo way at the bottom to Norway, Australia, New Zealand, way up at the top. And they cover everything. Another composite index is the Gender Inequality Index, which is all the different measures of gender equality. So some of the ones we've mentioned is female longevity versus male longevity. How much longer is a male going to live in most countries? In developed countries, women live longer than men do. But in less developed countries, they live much shorter lives on average. Literacy rates between men and women. When women are not investing in their human capital, then you're going to have more inequality, and then those women aren't going to be able to add to the workforce. They're not going to add to the labor force. They're not going to add to production, and you're not going to be able to grow very well. One of the interesting ones there is Iran. In Iran, they have a fairly similar demographic because they're a fairly developed country surrounded by less developed countries. To America in terms of female educational demographics. There are more women that go to college in Iran than males. And they get better grades and they get more advanced degrees like they do in America. Just a little thing like that, female education greatly improves the development of the overall country, even compared to the countries around it. All right. what are the other parts of female or gender inequality? Oh well, that's probably good enough. You guys talked about this. You did the assignment on it. Anyhow, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thanks.